On the night of December 15th, 1900, the SS Archtor was steaming through the North Atlantic toward Eilean Mor, the largest member of the Flannan Isles, a chain on the fringes of the Outer Hebrides, northwest of Scotland. As the ship drew within 5 or 6 miles, oppressive darkness loomed over the heavy seas. The Eilean Mor Lighthouse was not lit, the usually comforting candle in the night swallowed by the void. Captain Francis Holman duly logged the strange and hazardous outage, and his crew cautiously sailed on to the northernmost tip of the Isle of Lewis, nearly 50 miles distant. 11 days later, on December 26th, the supply tender Hesperus sailed into the Flannans and approached the lighthouse, bringing with it supplies for the keepers as well as assistant keeper Joseph Moore, who was returning from a 2-week furlough, having been delayed in the port of Stromness since the 20th due to bad weather. Captain James Harvey thought it strange that none of the 3 men stationed on the island were down at the landing. Surely the prospect of fresh food and 2 weeks off would excite at least one of them. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's horn and ordered a signal rocket to be fired, his only retort the endless churning of the sea. A launch was set out, and Moore was put ashore alone. He hurried up the slope to the tower high above, finding the outer gate and entry doors of the house closed, and all eerily quiet. Undoubtedly, Moore blanched as he searched the 3 bedrooms and the lamp house above, then ran back to the landing, scanning the whole of the island as he went. Nothing at all seemed amiss, save one chilling thing. His 3 companions were gone. A roughly triangular outcropping of metamorphic rock, blanketed by clover and moss, Eilean Mor's name literally means Big Isle, a somewhat misleading title, as the island totals only about 40 acres in size. The modest chain to which it belongs was likely named after Flannan MacTwaddlebeig, a 7th century bishop of the Celtic Church, who, it is thought, constructed a stone chapel on Eilean Mor's northern slope. Remains of this ancient structure, as well as another, can still be found today, and are known collectively as the Bothies of Clan MacPhail. Perhaps as an omen of strange fates, the Flannans were once commonly referred to as the 7 Hunters, a name taken from a fable in which 7 blasphemous men went hunting during the Sabbath and were thus cursed to live forevermore as a group of storm-lashed crags. Whatever one calls them, their reputation among fishermen and merchants was, and is, one of treachery and danger, as is much of the Scottish coast, the great expanse of the North Atlantic, a supremely inhospitable place throughout much of the year. Constructed in 1893 by the Northern Lighthouse Board, a quasi-governmental body responsible for lighthouses all around the Scottish coast, the Eilean Mor Light was first put into operation in late 1899. The tower stands about 75 feet high, the light itself just over 300 feet from the ocean's surface, designed to flash 2 white pulses every 30 seconds, visible for a distance of 20 nautical miles, or about 37 kilometers. Facilities for the quartering and comfort of a full-time staff were constructed on site, as well as a system of lightweight cranes and funicular tramways that ran between the main house and the 2 landings, one on the eastern side of the island and one on the west, the function of which was to aid the keepers with movement of supplies and equipment up and down the steep slope. Typically, lighthouses that were equipped with a foghorn, such as Eilean Mor, would employ a group of 4 keepers, 1 principal in the senior position, 2 assistants in-house, and 1 assistant on shore. Men would rotate off the island every 2 weeks. As a rule, 1 or more occasional keepers were also employed in an as-needed part-time capacity. These men were generally culled from the local population and used to replace keepers who had fallen ill or had been injured and could not perform their duties. The principal keeper on Eilean Mor and supervisor on the night of the Archtor's passing was James Duckett. A friendly and well-liked family man with over 20 years' experience, the Flannan Isle post would be his second as a principal, his first being at Loch Ryan some 3 years prior. Normally, the second in command was First Assistant William Ross. However, in a strange twist of fate, Ross had been on extended leave for 2 months due to an unspecified illness. In his place was the occasional keeper Donald MacArthur, an Army veteran from the village of Brestclete. Assistant Thomas Marshall was next in line, now second in command due to William Ross's absence. 29 years old and unmarried, Marshall had worked for the NLB since April of 1896, and by all indications had hoped to someday be promoted to a principal. The aforementioned Assistant Joseph Moore completed the roster, and was left in charge of the now vacant lighthouse, Captain Harvey lending him several crewmen to assist. Although he continued to perform his job admirably, Mor was later noted to be visibly shaken by these strange goings-on, and in a constant state of agitation for months afterward. Without a doubt, the story of the Eilean Mor Lighthouse is an enduring mystery, the circumstantial evidence pointing toward, but never quite directly at, a definitive answer. Some of this ambiguity can be attributed to several misconceptions that have found their way into the narrative. For example, it is often said that when Joseph Mor first entered the deserted lighthouse, he found a half-eaten dinner, overturned chair, and unmade beds. While Mor did in reality note the outer gate, entrance door, and first inner door were strangely closed, he never reported anything amiss regarding unfinished meals or upturned furniture. Much of this minutiae undoubtedly originates in the poem Flannan Isle by Wilfred Gibson. Yet as we crowded through the door, we only saw a table spread for dinner, meat and cheese and bread, but all untouched, and no one there, as though, when they sat down to eat, ere they could even taste, alarm had come, and they in haste had risen and left the bread and meat, for at the table head a chair lay tumbled on the floor. A literary gem, to be sure, but an imaginary contrivance nonetheless, adding an unseen urgency to whatever befell the three men. It is fairly easy to understand, then, why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used a similar device when publishing his equally fictional tale about the Mary Celeste several years earlier, J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement. Indeed, in his subsequent examination of the island, NLB Superintendent Robert Muirhead noted, quote, "The pots and pans had been cleaned and the kitchen tidied up, which showed that the man who acted as cook had completed his work." Unquote. This observation, as well as others reported by Mor, such as the beds being neatly made and the signal light properly serviced and in proper order, are completely in line with the reputation of the lighthouse keepers as being generally fastidious and conscientious workers. Regardless, the circumstances surrounding the three men's disappearances are strange, to say the least, and many theories have been put forth over the ensuing years, some more exotic than others. For centuries, the 7 islands of the Flannans, particularly Eilean Mor, have been the locus of tales of hauntings and evil spirits, even the ghost of St. Flannan himself. Besides ghosts, fairies, little men, and even skyfolk have long said to inhabit the island as well, exacting a vengeful curse upon those who would defile their home. Anyone who spent the night would be taken away to some heretofore unknown place, or even magically transmogrified into a bird, a tale echoed in the first part of Gibson's poem. Most viewers will undoubtedly interpret such stories as fanciful nonsense, yet some of these beliefs were taken very seriously by those most intimately involved. Hebridean shepherds who had taken their flocks across the sea to graze on the Big Island's lush grasses were reticent about staying there after sundown, and consequently there is no record of an overnight stay between the end of the first millennium and the 1800s. Regarding magical curses, John Mitchell, author of The Flying Saucer Vision, boldly ventures into the idea of the supposed use of the island by druids for ritualistic human sacrifice, as if the keepers had unwillingly checked all the boxes in some ancient spellbook. Quote, "The disappearance of the Flannan Island lighthouse keepers may be seen as an extraordinary repetition of an ancient sacrificial ceremony. The men were taken over, where they were installed in a tower, similar to those used once for human sacrifice. In the same way as a magic ritual, if properly carried out, the sequence of events involved in taking the lighthouse keepers to the Flannan Island's tower resulted in their disappearance." Unquote. Certainly a creative theory, if nothing else. Perhaps the answer to the mystery originates in the sea rather than the island itself. For instance, the demonic, shape-shifting kelpie of Scottish legend supposedly inhabit the waters around the Flannans, their ravenous reputation blamed by some even in 1900 for taking the keepers from one of the island's 2 landings. While one struggles to imagine an as-yet uncatalogued anthropomorphic shark climbing out of the water to make a dinner out of 3 weather-beaten men, it is certainly possible tales of deep-water denizens are based on something substantive. Throughout history, mythological creatures have been used as a proxy for something real but unidentified, as was the case whenever dinosaur fossils or mastodon skulls were used as evidence for dragons and cyclops. Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythology is rife with sea serpents, giant fish, and of course the famous kraken, the size and shape of which is amply shown in the popular drawing by Pierre Denis de Montfort of a specimen supposedly seen off the coast of Angola. Considering the still sizable gap in scientific knowledge of the ocean depths, the idea of gargantuan tentacles blasting out of the Atlantic to snatch Duckett and his comrades is just plausible enough to give one pause. Reports have been made, even during the 20th century, of very large birds abducting children and livestock from various locations, perhaps the most well-known occurring in 1977 in Lawndale, Illinois. One can almost picture Duckett and his co-workers running up the steep hill for the safety of the lighthouse, only to be plucked away like mice scurrying through an open field. And though hardly evidence, it is interesting to note that freakishly large birds, such as the Argentavis magnificens and Pelagornis sandersi, were likely more than capable of performing such a feat, that is, had either species not gone extinct several million years ago. Regular viewers should not be surprised that the subject of UFOs having something to do with the mystery has also been broached. While the idea is best seen as simply leaving no proverbial stone unturned, it should be noted that the Outer Hebrides have a storied history of UFO sightings, including a well-known photograph from 1947, considered by some to be one of the best ever taken. And regarding UFOs, the claims of little men and skyfolk on Eilean Mor certainly does seem odd in related context. Among the more prosaic explanations, it has been suggested that the men could have been taken from the island against their will by other men with nefarious motives. During the mid to late 1800s, relations between the British and certain foreign powers, mainly Germany, were quite frigid. In 1875, for example, Britain declared a no-tolerance policy in regard to German aggression toward France in what came to be known as the War in Sight crisis. Aggressive posturing by Germany grew under the watchful eye of Otto von Bismarck and successive chancellors, as well as Kaiser Wilhelm II, the grandson of Queen Victoria. Could spies from Germany have secretly landed on Eilean Mor? The Flannan Lighthouse does provide a necessary maritime service, and the Germans could have sought to disable the light in order to disrupt North Atlantic shipping. But it's doubtful that such a disruption would do much economic damage, even if successful. The lighthouse was under more or less constant observation, and did have a regular supply shipment. Any interruptions would have been quickly remedied. Of course, if the Germans knew of the island's ghostly reputation, something not particularly hard to discover, they could have hoped that, once stories of 3 men having mysteriously gone missing got back to the mainland, collective fear and superstition would cause the lighthouse to fall into complete disuse. Unorthodox forms of espionage would not be out of place in later decades. World War II saw everything from fake armies made of painted plywood to a plot to inject Adolf Hitler's homegrown carrots with estrogen. But such actions were born of desperation in the midst of open conflict. State-sanctioned tomfoolery on Eilean Mor in less chaotic pre-war years seems weirdly out of place, as does the idea of high-seas piracy. In any case, bad weather and geographic unfamiliarity would likely render any unauthorized landings very difficult. And even if such a feat were accomplished, the 3 keepers would likely not go willingly, and more signs of a struggle would have probably been apparent. According to his final report to the NLB, Robert Muirhead stated that he knew Duckett and Marshall intimately, and the occasional Donald MacArthur well, noting them as both efficient and competent. Considering the fact that Muirhead had a reputation at the NLB as a man of good judgment and character, it is hard to believe he would knowingly hire someone of questionable morals or sanity. And though it could be argued that the keeper's mental state may have deteriorated over the course of several months in such an isolated and uncongenial location, it would also be reasonable to assume that Muirhead was neither unfamiliar with the signs of psychological stress nor the associated negative personality traits. In 1965, writer Vincent Gaddis, in his book Invisible Horizons, True Mysteries of the Sea, recounted a series of log entries supposedly made by assistant keeper Thomas Marshall. Gaddis cites an article in the English magazine True Strange Stories by Ernest Fallon as his primary source. The logs are an admittedly intriguing read, possibly pointing to a rapidly eroding mental state in the 3 men. December 12. Gale, north by northwest. Sea lashed to fury. Stormbound. 9 p.m. Never seen such a storm. Everything shipshape. Duckett irritable. 12 p.m. Storm still raging. Wind steady. Stormbound. Cannot go out. Ship passed, sounding foggy. Could see lights of cabins. Duckett quiet. MacArthur crying. December 13. Storm continued through night. Wind shifted west by north. Duckett quiet. MacArthur praying. 12 noon. Gray daylight. Me, Duckett, and MacArthur prayed. December 15, 1 p.m. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. Unfortunately, the logs have since been proven a sensationalistic hoax. This fact is quite obvious when one considers the overwrought, flowery manner in which a normally perfunctory item like a naval log is written, as well as the questionable assertions made by Marshall. Would one really refer to his own boss as irritable in a document he could read at any time? And why would MacArthur, of all people, be crying? As Gaddis notes, quote, MacArthur was a hardened veteran seaman who had weathered the sea's worst blows, well known as a lusty, fearless brawler on land, unquote. There is also the uncontested fact that no log was actually recorded past December 13th. Marshall and Duckett made entries on a slate in chalk for a few days at a stretch, only transferring them to their permanent place inside the logbook at a later time. Joseph Moore observed the last entry made by the men was on the morning of the 15th, but that entry was made on the slate, not in the book. Still, MacArthur was in reality known as an argumentative, ill-tempered man, with a fuse as short as his stature. Though good at his job, at times he seemed to revel in conflict, particularly that involving James Duckett. On December 7, 8 days before the Archtor's passing, Robert Muirhead and his wife visited Eilean Mor. In his book The Lighthouse, author Keith McCloskey notes this visit as somewhat strange, especially considering the generally poor weather on the day. As Muirhead was known to view the Flannans as his pet project, such a visit may have been an unsolicited attempt to ease tensions between the principal and the occasional, which the superintendent could have viewed as a growing problem. MacArthur's position as an occasional meant he likely only expected to be on post for a brief span of time, yet he had already been forced to work 2 months. This interruption to his life's schedule may have been more than he could bear. If Duckett had requested MacArthur's help to secure the cranes or other rigging during less than amiable weather, he may have viewed this as an onerous and unfair request, as he was likely already acting as duty cook and housekeeper. It is possible that the two men had a heated exchange, after which Duckett then left with Marshall to perform the task at hand, leaving his subordinate with a stern rebuke. MacArthur could have then left the lighthouse in a fit of rage, escalating the harsh words into a full-blown fistfight, possibly sending all 3 of the men over the steep cliffs into the raging sea. While interpersonal conflicts, even violent ones, are nothing new, it seems this explanation is unnecessary considering the lack of even circumstantial evidence. Superintendent Muirhead spent a number of days investigating the mystery. At first, he theorized the men had been blown off the cliffs by a gale, but finding this explanation unsatisfactory, he concluded in his final report to the NLB headquarters on January 8, quote, an unexpectedly large roller had come up on the island, and a large body of water had swept them away with resistless force, unquote. Muirhead went on to note several sets of ropes housed in a crevice 70 feet up the tramway had been displaced, and a life buoy normally lashed to a railing was missing. Also, a large stone block weighing at least a ton had fallen from a cliff onto the concrete path leading to the western landing. Many people are not readily aware of the sheer weight and power behind something as commonplace as moving water. A wave only 10 feet deep and 20 feet long, modest by any standard, weighs as much as a fully loaded city bus. If something of that nature crashed into the western landing, it would have certainly thrown the men into the ocean like toys, with more than enough force to reach any associated equipment, even something as seemingly solid as the tramway and railings. Walter Aldebert, the principal keeper at Eilean Mor between 1953 and 1957, noted that the lamp itself, 300 feet high, was often splashed with spray. An amateur photographer, Mr. Aldebert spent a considerable amount of time documenting the often terrifying weather conditions, including one incident when he was crouching near a cliff almost 200 feet above the sea surface. Quote, a coil of rope lying on top and too solid to be shifted by the wind was washed off. The water lay a foot deep after the wave receded, unquote. As impressive as such testimony is, how can it explain the disappearance of all 3 men? Surely they would not all have been standing on or near the landing at the same moment. How could any rogue wave, even one big enough to crest the lower portions of the island's western side, be responsible for sweeping away 3 men simultaneously? If, like Muirhead and those that followed him, we consider all the known facts, a plausible scenario of the day's tragic events can be constructed. The men definitely vanished on December 15th, sometime after 9 a.m., but before dark. Duckett was especially good about keeping proper records. There would be no reason to doubt the 9 a.m. entry's veracity, nor to assume the men simply forgot to note anything later in the day, had they still been on the island. Also, the NLB maintained a strict policy that one keeper was to remain in the house at all times after dark to keep the light burning. Obviously, this policy was probably not always adhered to in every NLB lighthouse, and there was no way to really enforce it, provided the offenders weren't caught, but Duckett would likely be very hesitant to allow anything to jeopardize his income. According to his daughter Annabelle, in a 1990 interview in The Times, Duckett had been fined 5 shillings earlier in the year for negligence when some rope and tackle had washed away from the western landing. The weather on Saturday, December 15th, was growing worse. The final slate entry noted blustery rains and force 7 winds, which is about 30 knots on the Beaufort scale, nearly enough to blow one over from a standing position. Also, when the Archtor steamed by later that evening, Captain Holman noted the weather was clear but stormy. While this assessment is admittedly vague, reporting the late autumn weather in the North Atlantic is like recording the temperature of the Libyan desert in July, an assuredly foregone conclusion. A violent storm would in fact hit the Flannans on December the 17th. It was later estimated the associated winds were nearly hurricane force. Independent sources estimate waves as high as 30 feet. However, a considerable amount of open sea surrounds the Flannans, and consequently a constant wind has a great deal of surface to generate waves. This expanse is known as fetch. The fetch around the Flannans may have allowed waves as high as 75 feet to generate. Ironically, December 18th would see clear skies and only a light breeze. MacArthur was the last man to leave the lighthouse, and he did so in a great hurry. It is often claimed that Moore reported only 2 of 3 sets of oilskins were missing from their place near the front entrance, the remaining set still hanging from its hook. Though Moore did in fact find only 1 coat, the exact nature of the find is not generally reported correctly, although it does shine some light on the whole affair. Duckett was known to own a set of sea boots and a waterproof, what some would call a raincoat, Marshall a set of sea boots and an oilskin coat, and MacArthur a simple wearing coat that was designed to keep out the cold, but not water. This relatively lightweight garment is the one found by Moore. Of course, MacArthur could have borrowed one of the other men's more substantial coats, but the associated boots would not likely have fit him, so the theory isn't very sound. Still, whatever protection his meager coat offered was better than nothing, so he must have left quickly enough to disregard his own comfort. Duckett and Marshall likely went to the western landing sometime after breakfast, possibly with the intention of securing equipment to ease Duckett's mind against future fines or reprimands. Most of the trouble the men encountered was on the western side of the island, so this would be the logical place to focus their attention. While at the landing, an enormous rogue wave crashed into one of them, pushing him into the churning sea, possibly damaging some of the equipment in the process. The remaining man, unable to help on his own, threw a life buoy to the victim and ran as fast as humanly possible back toward the house, nearly tearing the gate and doors off their hinges as he shouted for MacArthur to come help. MacArthur then bolted out the door with his companion down the mossy slope, only for both of them to fall victim to a second wave of perhaps equal power. Despite the preponderance of evidence for a rogue wave, 2 anomalies in the observations made during the initial search by the crew of the Hesperus and the subsequent investigation by Robert Muirhead point to other possibilities. First, why did Joseph Moore find the exterior gate, entry door, and first interior doors closed? It is conceivable 1 or more gusts of wind could have closed the doors after the men left the house for the last time, though this would necessitate the inner door closing first, otherwise there would likely not be enough of a variance in air pressure to do the job on both the inner and outer doors. Though to some the explanation rings hollow, a stiff breeze is admittedly more plausible than a boat full of foreign spies or saucer full of spacemen. Still, it is quite intriguing to wonder what could have happened had the wind not been the culprit. Would pirates or spies have bothered to close doors and gates? And if the last man to leave of his own accord, presumably MacArthur, had the time and composure to shut the door behind himself, why did he not take his coat? Here, the idea of a murder or murder-suicide once again rears its ugly head. If, instead of instigating a murder, MacArthur had himself been killed by 1 or more of the other lightkeepers, the assailants could have taken his body outside and closed up with the intention of returning. As a matter of course, it would then be necessary for said assailants to have died either by their own hand, or once again by something like a rogue wave. Otherwise, they would have undoubtedly returned to the house and relit the light, offering some plausible story of MacArthur et al., meaning a tragic though accidental death. If the guilty party was indeed Duckett or Marshall bent on killing himself after disposing of the bodies of his comrades, he could have closed the doors and gates in a final act of reservation, a behavior that could certainly be associated with an imminent suicide. As is often said, anything is possible, though possible does not mean plausible. A second oddity regarding the wave theory, and indeed any theory that involves men cast into the icy North Atlantic by whatever means, is somewhat harder to explain. No trace of the three men, not a single piece of clothing nor personal article has ever been found on Eilean Mor nor any of the Flannans. This is hard to believe given the ease with which many contaminants are brought ashore, especially when the odds against having all evidence lost grow considerably worse with each man involved. Of course, 1,000,000 to 1 is still infinitely more likely than 0, so it seems, short of some miraculous revelation, the most sensible conclusion is any investigation has simply encountered a bit of abnormally bad luck. The Eilean Mor Lighthouse has been automated since 1971, and keepers no longer stand guard on the rocky cliffs of the remote island. Machines, not men, watch the reefs and shores all over the world, the lonely and tedious and mythically romantic life of a live-in lighthouse keeper, a relic of the past. The fact that the fates of Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur is not only unknown, but unknowable is unsettling, to say the least. One can hardly blame Joseph Moore being overcome by a sense of looming dread as he searched the vacant yet strangely ordered lighthouse. Though being drowned by a rogue sea wave seems the most likely scenario, we'll never know with absolute certainty that a Lovecraftian Leviathan didn't swallow them whole, or that vengeful spirits of ancient Earth, or nefarious birds, or beings from across the galaxy didn't carry them off to another world. If in fact the Lightkeepers of Eilean Mor did fall prey to the awesome might of the sea, we should both honor their courage and heed their watery fates as a warning. For all the technology at our disposal, human power is but a candle against the towering waves of the natural world, ready to crash down and extinguish us at any moment.